Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone, and welcome to my channel. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ford EcoBoost and a very, very common coolant leak. It is the number one thing that goes wrong with this truck. It's the first thing that I look at when I look at these things that I look for. And this is the first time I've ever done this job. I'm going to show you what it is, and I'm going to show you how to do it. And so in this video, while you're watching this video, if you like it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that bell so that way you get notified of all the future videos that I'm going to be putting out. And also check me out on Instagram at Nuts and Bolts with Tone for my daily life as a mechanic. Show you all kinds of cool stuff. All right, so let's get into this EcoBoost. EcoBoost. So this is a 2013. It's got 2 turbos, and so the really common coolant leak on this is the coolant fittings and lines. They leak. All right, so a lot of times the fittings can leak from, it's a fitting with an O-ring on the bottom for the threads, and it threads in, and then it's got like the little C-clip around it, like a transmission cooler line, and then it's got the line that snaps in. Got to pull the clip back, pull the line out. So most of the time, this design, it leaks where the fitting, it's got an O-ring in there, and it leaks where the line and the fitting connect. All right, so these 6-7 power strokes, they're common for this thing. You know, it's just a pretty crappy design, and it leaks on all of them. But anyway, so this one here, this engine has 4 coolant lines. So because it's got 2 turbos. So it's got a feed line that comes off the block. It's got a fitting, a feed line that comes off the block, goes to each turbo, a fitting in the turbo. Then on the outside of the turbo, it's got a fitting on each turbo, a line that wraps around the back of the head, and fittings into the back of the heads. So I did things a little bit different in this video. So I've seen guys do this job, and I've seen it where they start off with, it's got a fitting leaking. And they replace the fitting, and they get done, and it's still leaking because the line's leaking. Because the line and the fitting just mate, and when you do the repair, you do them both. 6-7 power stroke, you replace the line and the fitting. You don't replace one. So anyways, so I watched this guy go and replace one fitting, and then he had to replace the line. Then the other turbo was leaking, and it was just a big cluster. So when I saw this, I saw both turbos leaking. So you know what? Both turbos need to come off. We're doing all 4 lines, all 4 fittings, and this thing is like over 15 hours of work. It's a lot of work. So to do this job, the way you have to do it is you have to remove the turbos off of the vehicle. So you have the return lines that come around from the back of the head, and they come around the side of the turbo. So to get those off, you need to take off the intake manifold and the coolant crossover, reach around the back of the engine and go between the firewall and the head and try to fish the little C-clip out of the fitting with a mirror. Pop the clip out, pull the line off, and then fish it through the harness on both sides, and then get it out. And then take the turbos out, and then do the pressure line, the feed lines, and all of that. So I decided to do a little different. And I thought it was good to do it because I've only done this once. I decided to pull the cab. So I've only pulled one cab, and it was on a 6.4 power stroke. So I thought, hey, this, shouldn't be too bad. Well, it wasn't that bad. It just took me a lot longer than I planned. I think it took me close to 3 hours to get the cab off because I wasn't familiar with this cab. I wasn't real sure of everything that had to be taken off and undone. And I honestly, I did a little research just trying to see, just to kind of get an overview of what I needed to do, and there was nothing. And so I had to just tackle it hey, you see it, unbolt it, when it comes apart, you're done. And so I even have a little footage of, when the cab is going up, I had to stop, had a connector stuck, had a couple things happen, and you'll see that later in the video. I show you how to kind of what you need to do to get the cab off of this. And then to kind of talk about the turbos, how to take them off, the fittings, things like that. So anyways, let's get into it. 2013 EcoBoost, coolant lines and fittings. Let's check it out. We got 2013 F150 ecoboost. This one's got leaking turbo coolant hoses on both sides. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the cab on this one. Otherwise you have to remove the intake manifold, the coolant crossover, you have all this stuff you have to take off. And then you're trying to fish out these little C-clips blind behind the heads. So I'm gonna take off this cab and make it easier. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna disconnect the heater hoses. We're gonna disconnect both radiator hoses and fold those back to the engine. Okay, I took off this center of the intake air piping right here that just connects it to the air box. We're gonna disconnect right there. We're gonna disconnect the degas bottle, the brake booster hose. We're gonna disconnect the ground strap here. We disconnected both of the PCM connectors and undid all the clips from the wheel lining. We're gonna disconnect, there's a couple connectors over here. We got to disconnect this fuse box from the engine harness that stays with the car. Got to disconnect the battery. We're going to have to disconnect both charge air hoses from the intercooler. And let's see what else. Transmission shift control cable. All right, let me get started on this and I'll let you know the rest of the stuff that has to come off. And then we'll see what it looks like with the cab in the air. So here we are, and now we're into this cab removal. Basically what you gotta do is you gotta take off this little material cover here. You gotta disconnect the condenser right there and pull that line through. Disconnect the electrical connector and pull this through this way. You gotta disconnect this AC line here, and it's gonna come that way. Got the upper hose here. Got the battery out. And all these cables, because they're gonna stay with the frame and they're gonna tuck over to the frame. For the brake booster hose, you just disconnect it at the vacuum pump there. There's a button you push in and the line comes out. Let's see. Got the upper hose here. You got right down here on the passenger side of the intercooler, there's two hoses that go down there. And there's about a 10-inch piece of rubber hose between the plastic and the intercooler. I just took both of those rubber hoses out, so that way I have the plastic tubes don't hit on the way up. On this side here of the intercooler, down there, you got another connection there, and that goes up here to the throttle body. All right, I just took that out to get it out of the way. You got to disconnect the lower radiator hose right there. Pop the clip out, spray some WD-40, it comes out. I took out this box here because so this is the battery box, I mean the air box and the coolant reservoir, and I took that out because the master cylinder was going to hit. So you disconnect the electrical connector on the master cylinder. There's a wire harness that goes under the master and it clips on both of the studs. You got to unclip that and disconnect the brake booster connector there. You got the breather for the front differential right there that wraps around over here. You got to take that off, fish it out, roll that through. You got to disconnect the steering shaft there and down there. Just get it out of the way so you're not fighting it. Just mark it so you know, make sure it goes back in the right spot, because you never know what's going to happen. Let's see. So the radiator hose is going to stay with this thing. All the brakes are going to stay with it. The master cylinder is attached to the ABS module. The master cylinder is just going to fold over to the engine. That's why there's these braided lines here that allow the master cylinder to move over to stay with the engine. Disconnect the heater hoses. When you're disconnecting these heater hoses that have those squares in there, a little tip right here is you want some pliers like this, and they depress those tabs. So once we get, and then there's the transmission cooler hoses. See if I can let you see it right there. All right, there's two plastic connectors that go over them to keep them, to make sure they don't pop off. You gotta use a tool and disconnect those. Once I get those off, I have to disconnect the transmission control shift cable and the parking brake, and I believe that's it. All right, let me get back to it, and I'll let you know if there's anything else that needs to come off.
Go ahead. Oh, stop.
Stop. Connect back there. Everything connected here. Oh, it scared me. This thing was hanging way down. I was like, what? The fuel pump would be pretty. What? I said the fuel pump would be pretty. Oh, it's a real one now. Yeah, but replace the fuel pump. Very cool. Okay, so here we go. Got the cab off. There it is. All right, a few little pointers. So the cab mounts, the body mounts, just turn them and hold it tight while you're turning it. And the back one back there is inside of a housing. You have to push it up and then turn, and then it pops out. And it sticks onto a nipple, and then you have a bolt that goes onto. Couple things. You got to disconnect the parking brake cable, and you have to take it out of the bracket. Let's see, a couple things that I had to do. You got to disconnect the vacuum line from the booster. You got ABS connector on both sides. 2 body control connectors right here, harnesses. You got to unclip those. ABS module. One thing you do not have to do is you do not have to disconnect these intercooler tubes to get it out of to get the cab off. For some reason I had a brain fart and it didn't really dawn on me that the intercooler was staying. So technically this pipe that goes down to there could have stayed, and both of those. I still have to take them off to do it, but anyways, let's see. You got to disconnect the hood latch cable, and there's 2 10mm bolts here, 8mm bolts that hold the front of the top of the bumper, or the vanity part of the bumper, onto the actual bumper. These body mounts here, you have to come in through the side and catch the nut on top because the cage will spin. And it is a 7/8 wrench. All the rest came out. And then you have an 8mm ground strap here that mounts to the body. And the transmission control cable. You got to take the lights out. Well, you don't have to take the lights out. You got to disconnect the fog lights. I ripped one of the connectors out. On this side, I ripped one of the wires out of the connector. That's it. Not too bad. So here we go. Here's those transmission cooler lines. All right. First time doing it, it took me 3 hours to get the cab off, but there's no instructions for this, so I kind of had to wing it. All right, so here we go. Here's the turbo, and this is why we're in here. All right, so what you will see on a common coolant leak on these is right here. You will see coolant running down the oil drain, okay? And it'll leak down, and that right there is coming from your coolant fittings. There's one there, and then there's one on the inside of the turbo that goes to the block. All right, so the reason that I took the cab off was because of this this line here wraps around and it goes to the back of the head. Now, if you didn't take the cab off, you would have to take the intake manifold off, the water cross, the coolant crossover, and then you have to reach around here with a pick and get that C-clip out of there, and then unthread that, pop it all back in. And same thing on this side. You have to take the vacuum pump off, and then there's the fitting there. So we're gonna be doing all this just straight up from the back. So we're gonna get these turbos off. Gonna take off all these, all the intake piping, the intake and the intercooler piping right there. You got the 2 hoses there. We're gonna pop those off, and we're gonna disconnect the electrical. And let's see. That's about it. I'm gonna get everything sprayed up, so hopefully all the bolts come loose. All right, same thing on both sides. Oh, and your wastegate hose right there. You gotta disconnect that. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so for the right turbo, We got to take this bolt out right here. It's a bracket here. We got to get this out, and the AC compressor sits right in front of this. So you got to take the AC compressor off. So there's one connector to the compressor right here, and one clip right there. You got to undo that. It's a stretch belt, so if you pull the belt this way while you rotate the crank, it'll walk off the compressor. You just have 3 bolts holding it on, right there, and right there. All right, and then just lay this forward, and then let's get to that bracket. As you can see, back here you can see those 2 pipes that come up from behind, and those both go to this bracket here. All right, we're gonna take this off. All right, so turbos are off. Okay, so basically what you gotta do is when we're removing this bolt right here that goes to the bracket, this is the bracket for the coolant feed line that goes here. All right, it just goes over the top of this oil line. The oil line does not have to come off, but you should remove it to check the screen, or really you should replace the screen. So in this case, here's what it looks like. So here's the oil supply tube and feed assembly, the drain, feed, everything. So you got an O-ring at this end, and there's a TORX bolt here, and there's a TORX bolt there. All right, now this bracket goes through that one. So this sits on top of that one. So you don't technically have to take this off. So now what goes on here is this, the screen. So the original design is a hex head internal, and the replacement is a socket type on the outside. So on the driver's side, I think I'm gonna have to take the alternator off to replace it. I got it off, but I'm gonna have to replace it by pulling the alternator because I can't get to it with a socket. So here we go. So we got a new screen. Now the driver's side, the opening, the thread opening is much larger, so it's a bigger hole. So it'll look different. So here we are. So we're gonna get all this new stuff here. All right, here's the turbo. There's that inside coolant fitting right there. This is the feed line, and this goes right here to the block. And that goes right there, all right? So we're gonna replace that fitting. We're gonna replace the one on the turbo, and we're gonna do new lines, replace that oil filler, the oil filter for the turbo, get this all cleaned up, get it back in. That's how you do a turbo on this ecoboost. Let's go. All right, so during this job here, here's the oil line. You're gonna get a turbo install kit. It's gonna come with that O-ring. It's gonna be blue. And that line over there just goes inside the fitting. You're gonna lube that up. You're gonna get new oil supply fittings, and that has a filter on it, built into it. You're gonna put new coolant fittings there. All right. So to do this side here, the original design has a hex head inside. You can get it out. But to put a new one in, which is a 1-inch socket for that, you have to take out the alternator stud right here. You gotta take out the stud for the alternator and then kick the alternator over so you can get on it with a wobble and get that in, get it torqued. I'm gonna leave it sitting like this to give me more room to get the turbo in with the lines. This side over here, AC compressor has to come off. Same thing. Got a new supply fitting there with a filter in it. Got a new coolant fitting. Now this supply fitting on this side, the thread's diameter is smaller than the other side. You're gonna think that you have the wrong parts, but the left side is larger than the right. All right. The other thing that you wanna do is, before you pull your lines off, mark the orientation of how it goes. So I know that my line is gonna go right across here. So when I put it in, I'm not fighting it. It'll rotate, but that way I'm not fighting it. I did the same thing on both sides. So now I'm gonna clean up all the gasket surfaces and get the new lines installed and get them on the car. Let's go. All right, so here we go. Yesterday before I went home, got the turbos mounted. All right, so this side over here, to take the turbo out, you don't have to take the starter out. But if you undo to do the oil tube, to do the oil feed, you have to take the turbo out, and you should, because of the whole filter at that end and the fitting. So all you got to do is, there's a 10mm down there that holds the tranny cooler lines on. Take that off, undo the two 13mm studs, and the starter will fall down, and that actually gives you more room for the oil feed, for the oil pipe to mount to the turbo. So that gives you room on this side. All right, so the other thing that you got to do if you're going to do this in the truck without pulling the cab, after you pull the intake and the coolant crossover, you have to take the vacuum pump off. We sold the vacuum pump because it's leaking, so I got to replace that now, and then I got to put this return line on, and then I got to slap the compressor on, put the intake tubes, the intake and the charge air pipes back in. Come over to this side, alternators back in, turbos in. Everything on this side is back together. Got the coolant, got the new coolant pipe in with the new fittings. Make sure you look at these fittings because they're all different. There's three different fittings. So make sure you look them up and put them in the right spot. All right, there we go. All right, let's get this thing done and get this cab dropped down. So this is what it looks like right here, cab off. Look at that. Your first one's gonna take you a lot longer, but after that, you should be able to knock your time down by half. All right, for your second one, let's go. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Every once in a while, I come across a job and I just really think, I just think to myself, I really wanna make a video about this, and I get really excited. And this was one of them. I was really excited about doing this, and really excited to share with you what it looks like to do this job with the cab off. Even though it took me longer to take the cab off than I planned, the whole thing will still be a lot faster than if I had just done the coolant lines in the truck. And it was a lot less hassle of, working, around the truck itself. So putting it back on would be a lot quicker, and then the next time would take me a lot less time, half the time next time. Plus I took apart things I didn't need to take apart. Just had a brain fart. You look at something and you're like, oh yeah, you take it apart, you're like, oh yeah, that was dumb. Why did I do that? So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've never taken a cab off, maybe this inspires you to try to take it off. I mean, it's a little nerve-wracking to pull a cab at first. Funny thing is, this was the second cab I pulled. I wasn't nervous at all, weirdly. I had a couple hang-ups, but I wasn't nervous at all about this one. Careful, but not nervous. But the whole thing turned out better than I planned, and the job was still a pain in the butt. And those turbos, it was a real pain to do that job, even with the body out of the way. I can't imagine doing it in the truck, because it was not fun. It was a pain, just doing it with no cab. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.